Are you good enough? Ask yourself the question, am I good enough? Look in the mirror and say, am I good enough? Now, I realize that question is too ambiguous. You can't really answer that question. It needs some context, needs some clarification. Like, am I good enough at what? For what? Compared to what? Am I good enough? For example, if you're a baseball player, am I good enough might be answered by, well, if I went to the plate and got 4 hits out of every 10 times I was at bat, I'd be more than good enough. I'd be in the Hall of Fame. If I were a baseball pitcher and 3 out of every 6 pitches I threw were strikes, I would not be in the Hall of Fame. I would be the greatest baseball pitcher in all of human history. But if I were an airline pilot and I only successfully landed 3 out of every 6 times, I would be dangerous. I would not be a pilot. If I were a heart surgeon and only 4 out of every 10 of my patients survived, I would not just lose my license, I would be in prison. So what is the context? What does it mean when we ask ourselves, am I good enough? Well, if we look through the lens of the Bible tells us, when I ask the question, am I good enough? In unambiguous terms, the answer is no, you are not. All throughout the Bible, there are verses, there are axioms, there are predictions, there are pronouncements of our imperfection. For example, in the 14th Psalm, it says that there is no one who is good, and not even one. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7, it says there's no one who does good or does what is right, not even one. Isaiah chapter 64 says that even when we get it right, our righteousness is as filthy rags. The Apostle Paul is very unambiguous in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, where he says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All there means all. The Bible, in fact, is a collection of stories of human imperfection. It is story after story of failures and shortcomings and inadequacies. From the first story in the garden till the last story, it is a story of human failure and frailty. The Bible unambiguously answers the question, are you good enough? With a resounding no. But the Bible also says, yes, you're not only good enough, you are worth dying for. John chapter 3, verse 16 tells us that God so loved the world, and the world is us, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not die, but have the promise of everlasting life. That same Apostle Paul, who in Romans chapter 3 said that all have sinned, in Colossians chapter 2, verse 20 says, it is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I am crucified with Christ. And it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me and who loved me and gave himself for me. You see, it's both and. It's not either no or yes. It's both yes and no. This is the paradox of grace. Grace is the in-between the yes and the no. The yes, I am worth dying for, and no, I am not good enough. And if you know nothing else about Riverbend Church, whether you've been here 4 Sundays or 40 years of Sundays, you know that Riverbend is a place that embraces the idea of grace. We love to identify ourselves as a grace church. That is our mission. But what does that mean? Well, one thing it means, and it means different things to different people, but one thing it means for sure is that if you identify yourself with this family of faith, you are saying, I need grace. is an admission that we are imperfect, we are flawed, we are messed up, we are the marginalized failures of the world, and we need grace. That's why we are here, because we are seeking an unconditional love from God, a grace of God. And that's what this means. It also means that this is a place that lives in between. That this is a place not of either or, but of both and. This is a place in the middle that as a church of grace, as a place that embraces grace, we are called to be on the razor's edge. The razor's edge that is not either or, but both and. The razor's edge that is the peacemaker, that is the bridge builder, that is called, our mission is to bring people together to find the love and the grace of God. That is our mission. You see, we are called to believe like we behave. We are called to show what we know. We are called to stand in between truth and grace, and faith and works. And this is how faith works. Over the next 3 weeks, I want us to go out onto that tightrope. It's a theological razor's edge, and say, what does it look like for us to truly be a people of grace? What does it look like when our faith works? It is not a journey for the faint of heart. It is a journey for those who are willing to say, I will choose the harder path. I will choose the messier faith. But I want to be on the razor's edge. I want to be the peacemaker and the bridge builder. I want to be the both and. Not only because I know I need grace, but because I know I live in a world that needs it too. But before we step out onto that tightrope, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your word, spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit, to challenge us to be both and, to be a people of grace, to show how our faith works. Pray that for myself and for my family, and for everyone who will hear this message or even encounter this people and this place. For I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. At this point in my life, I consider that the greatest accomplishment that Diane and I have made is that we have raised 3 beautiful young women. You see, we had 3 children in 6 years. We had 3 daughters born 2 years apart. And so we lived for most of our lives with 3 children in our home. There was a season where they were all preschoolers, where they were all elementary school. And then for 11, almost 12 years, we had at least 1 teenage girl in our house. In fact, for 4 years, we had 3 teenage girls living in our home. It was during this time that I realized what a confused human being I was. I was more confused than a chameleon in a bag of Skittles. I didn't know what was going on. And throughout that period of time, during those 11 or 12 years when we had a teenage girl living in our home, there were 3 words that I repeated at least a half a dozen times a day. And these were the 3 words: ask your mother. But my daughters also had 3 words that they repeated to me almost as frequently as I told them to ask their mother. And they were these 3 words: you don't understand. Now, I'm a pretty smart guy, and I'm paying attention, and I know a lot of things, but my daughters insisted on a regular basis that I did not understand. Now, you may say, well, Dave, they're just playing teenage girl semantic tricks with you. There is no difference between knowing and understanding. Well, the American Psychological Association would beg to differ with you. The American Psychological Association has written articles and done studies on what is the difference between understanding and knowing. They define knowing this way. Knowing is a static mental state involving the cognition of discernible facts. And understanding is an active state of analyzing and placing facts in their larger context and proactively responding to those facts. To put it very simply, knowing is taking it in. Knowing moves this direction. Understanding is contextualizing it and applying it out. Understanding moves this way, and knowing moves this way. I want to suggest to you today that most of us would say, you know what is better than knowing or understanding? Both knowing and understanding. Don't be a person who just knows things or a person who just understands things. Be a person who both knows and understands. And if that is true, I want to suggest that knowing is to understanding as faith is to works. It's not either faith or works. It's both faith and works. And in the paradox of grace, that paradox where we are between believing and behaving, and knowing and understanding, and truth and grace, and faith and works, we are a people who are called to be both and to have a faith that works. This is how faith works. But it presents us with two challenges. The first challenge is a biblical challenge. What does the Bible say about how faith works? And it's very difficult. It's one of the great theological challenges, particularly of the New Testament. Because in the book of Ephesians, in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, the Apostle Paul writes that we are saved by grace through faith. And it is not of ourselves, it is the gift of God, so that none of us can be proud of what we accomplish, so that we realize it's not up to us. It is the gift of God, so none of us can boast. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 is the foundation stone of a church like Riverbend. It is our biblical sine qua non. It was the foundation stone of the Reformation and the cornerstone of what turned into the transformation of the expression of Christianity throughout the world for 500 years. Came from this idea that we are saved by grace through faith. But if you turn in your Bibles just a few pages along in the New Testament, you come to a book called the book of James. And in James chapter 2, the Apostle James says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith, but there's no evidence of it in their life? They show no evidence of behaving in a way that indicates their belief. They have no deeds that align with their faith. Can such a faith save them? Let me give you an example. For example, suppose that a brother or sister doesn't have enough clothes or doesn't have enough food, and you encounter them and you say to them, I'll pray for you, or Lord bless you. You go in peace and be warmed and well fed. And that's all you do, and you go on your way. What have you really done for them? What difference have you made in their life? What have you done by simply saying, be warm and well fed, or I'll bless you, or I'll pray for you? He goes on to say, in the same way, faith, if it's faith alone, and it's not accompanied by a transformed behavior, is dead. It is worthless. It is a corpse. It has no value. But someone will say, well, I have faith, and I'm a good person. I do good things. I have good deeds. But if you have a faith that is not connected to your behavior, if you have a belief that is not reflected in your behavior, I'll tell you what you need. You need to demonstrate your faith by your behavior, by your deeds. I will show you my faith by my deeds. This paradox between the Apostle Paul and the Apostle James has vexed the church since the church began, particularly for the last 500 years since the Reformation. In fact, wars have been fought over the difference of whether it is faith or works in which we put our trust, whether we measure the sincerity of our hope based on our faith or our works. Wars have literally been fought over this. Martin Luther, the initiator of the Reformation, actually did not believe that the book of James even belonged in the Bible. He couldn't handle it. These were two opinions that were polar opposites coming from two men who were polar opposites. The Apostle Paul began his life as a young rabbi. By the time he was 12 years old, he was shipped off from his home in Tarsus of Syria to go to school in Jerusalem. And he studied at the Harvard of the training of seminarians and rabbis and legal experts. He studied at the feet of the greatest teacher of his day, a man named Gamaliel. And Saul of Tarsus was an A student. He graduated magna cum laude. By his own description, he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He applauded as his Pharisaical peers beat to death one of the first disciples, a man named Stephen. He was a highly trained, professional, rabbinic theologian. He knew the law backwards and forwards. He lived a rigorous and disciplined life. James, on the other hand, had no formal theological training. He was a carpenter's son. He got all of his theological training because he grew up in the same house as Jesus. They had the same mother. Even though he was not really a follower of Jesus until after the resurrection so transformed his life that he became the first pastor of the first church ever in Jerusalem. And he devoted the rest of his life, as far as we know, he never left Jerusalem. He devoted his life to bringing the story of the man he grew up with, Jesus, and the resurrection to the circumcised, to the nation of Israel. After his conversion on the road to Damascus, the Apostle Paul did exactly the opposite. He never stayed in Jerusalem again. He traveled throughout the Roman Empire, taking the gospel to the uncircumcised, to the Gentiles of the world. And their theological positions have frustrated theologians for thousands of years. But I don't believe that they were talking about two different things. You see, I don't think it was faith or works. I believe it was faith and works. It was both. It was not either or. And in the coming weeks, we're going to dive into this more theologically, and it's going to be some deep stuff. But let me tell you where it begins. It begins back in the book of Ephesians. Because if you read in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 that we are saved by grace through faith and not of works, you have to continue reading to the next verse, verse 10. Because in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, the Apostle Paul says, we are his workmanship, we are his handiwork. And we are created in Christ Jesus, what? To do good works, which God has prepared in advance for us to do. We were born for this. This is the nature of the paradox of believing and behaving, of truth and grace, of knowing and understanding, of faith and works. But the biggest problem is not the biblical problem. I think the biblical solution is that these are two sides of the same coin. Faith and works are inseparable. They go together. The biggest problem is not biblical. The biggest problem is ecclesiological. How does that work itself out in a church? How does that work itself out in a church like Riverbend? How does this paradox of grace, what does the tightrope look like? Well, I can tell you what it is not. It is not spiritual virtue signaling. It is not pompous and pious behavior that calls attention to its own righteousness. I know that it's not that. You see, I'm old enough to remember, and there are some of you here who will remember this because you're as old as I am. But I remember going to the first church that meant anything to me. After I became a Christian at 18 years old, I was a new believer, and the first church I went to was a little Baptist church in central New Jersey, Calvary Baptist Church. And I walked in there and I freaked out because all of the men in the church had on suits and ties, and all of the women had dresses. And I soon found out that women were looked down on if they wore slacks to church. And if you were a man who came to church without a tie on, you got a side eye for sure. And if you actually tried to enter that church through the greeters at the front door, and heaven forbid that you smelled of cigarette smoke, they might tell you that perhaps you might want to come back another Sunday. Anybody familiar with churches like that? In fact, when I was in college, I signed a behavioral covenant. And the behavioral covenant said, I make a vow that I will not use alcohol. I will not use tobacco or any other smokable substance. I will not go to movies. I will not use playing cards. I will not go to movies. This was when Star Wars came out. And all my friends were saying, you got to see this movie. And I'm like, no, I signed this covenant for 4 years, never violated the covenant. We had a saying among my friends, we don't smoke and we don't chew and we don't go out with girls that do. So I know what I'm talking about. And I needed that. You see, in my spiritual infancy, I needed the rules. I needed the boundaries. I needed to know what to believe. I needed to know what to think. I needed to know how to behave. Because I was a blank slate. I didn't know. I didn't know that this was inappropriate. I didn't know you couldn't get to heaven if you smoked cigarettes. I had to be told these things. I didn't understand this. And I needed that. I needed the boundaries. I needed the rules. I needed the clarity. I needed the black and white, the left and right, the good and the bad, the up and the down. I needed that. And I understand it. I understand that there are people who need that. And God bless you. God bless you if you need the boundaries, if you need to be around people who think like you and believe like you and have the same values that you have, and don't challenge your presuppositions. They affirm you. They say, you are not a crazy person. You are like us. We are together. I understand that. It's a beautiful thing. And I promise you, you can go to any one of 100 churches in Austin today. And while they may not have explicit behavioral covenants, they have explicit doctrinal statements, and they have, you know what it is. Come on, this isn't your first rodeo. You know what the church is like. There's implicit expectations. If you don't live this way, you don't behave this way, you don't think this way, you certainly don't ask those kinds of questions. And I thank God for those churches, I really do. Because I know there are people that's what they need. They need places like that. They need places where they can go and they can say, you're okay. You're like us. Think like us. Act like us. Dress like us. Behave like us. And that's good. And that is good. Don't get me wrong. That is a blessing. I am thankful that there are hundreds of churches in Austin like that, because I know there are people that need that. And I'm also thankful for that because that means we don't have to be that. If you break your leg, you don't go to HEB. If you need fresh produce, you don't go to a daycare center. If you need your child cared for, you don't drop them off at Jiffy Lube. This is the place that is the HEB of daycare centers and Jiffy Lubes. Now, I wish I could tell you that we were all those things for everyone who needs it. But the one thing we will be is we will be the people in between. We'll be the people of grace. We'll be the people who say, okay, I may not like you, I may not agree with you, I may not do what you do, but I am called to show the grace that has been shown to me. I promise you, I am the most conservative, most orthodox theologian in this room. I'm a biblical literalist, for crying out loud. But you know what that means for me? That means I'm called to put that, what I believe is true, into behavior. That I am called because of grace to show grace. And that's messy. Oh man, is that messy. And it's hard. It is the razor's edge. And I got to tell you, after 18 years of being here and doing this, I look around and I'm like, has this made any difference at all? Has 18 years of devoting my life to this place and to this mission even made any difference? Has it even moved the needle? Because I look around and it seems like we haven't moved, we haven't budged. And you know what I've realized? Grace isn't about going somewhere. Grace is about being something. And I know what we are being. We are being a people of grace, a people in between, people on the tightrope, on the razor's edge, between believing and behaving, between truth and grace, between knowing and understanding, between faith and works, because this is how faith works. So how do we do it? How do we do it? How do we live in this, on this edge? Well, there's no formula. There can't be a formula. It's going to be different for you than it is for me. It's going to be different for the person down the road from you. It's going to be different for the people that live in the house with you. It is a handmade, personalized practice of faith. But I know where it begins. I know where it begins. It begins with an attitude. And the attitude is this: I will seek to understand before I need to be understood. I will seek to serve before I need to be served. I will seek to show you grace, even if you never show it to me. You see, that's where it starts. And that's why it's hard. And that's why not everybody does it. That's why when I look at you every Sunday, what I see are some of the most courageous people in Austin, because you're willing to do the heavy lifting. You're willing to do the hard climb, because it is. But I believe that's how we understand. That's how we move from knowing to understanding. And it's the understanding that changes us. Transformation comes with understanding. When we were young parents, when Diane and I were young parents, our oldest daughter, and I have a hard time believing this, but she's going to turn 40 years old this year. When she was 7 months old, we wanted to go back to the farm for Christmas. We were living in Dallas, and so we got on a plane and we flew up to New Jersey, and my parents came and picked us up at the airport. And I remember getting in the car with their first granddaughter, and we were driving out of the airport, and I remember exactly what I said to my mom and dad. I said this: I'm sorry. Because I knew what I had put them through. I understood for the first time in my life the sacrifices they made, the decisions they made to love and to care for me, because I was making them. I was making those decisions for that little nugget for 7 months without sleep. I understood what they had been through for the first time in my life. The last 5 months of my life have been a joy, as I am, as you all know, a first-time grandfather of what I am not ashamed to say is the most adorable grandchild ever in the history of humanity. And I love seeing her and I love being around her, but I tell you what I love even more. I love watching my baby girl with her baby girl. You know why? Because I know she understands. She understands something about what it means to have a life invested in another life. And if God is gracious enough to me to allow me to live to see little Frankie D as a teenager, I cannot wait. Because I believe in the principle of apples and trees, and what goes around comes around. And I raised that girl as a teenager, and she was a tornado. And I can't wait till little Frankie D gets to be a 13-year-old little girl in my daughter's home, because it's going to be exciting. But more than that, I can't wait for the day when she can watch her daughter grow and be an amazing young woman like I've had the privilege of doing. That's how we understand. That's how we move from knowing to understanding. We practice what we preach. We believe according to what we behave. We show what we know. Knowing is to understanding as faith is to works. We, Riverbend Church, this is our mission. It is our mission to be on the razor's edge, to be on that tightrope, to be in that messy space in between. Not the space of either or, but the space of both and. Because I believe we are the peacemakers, we are the bridge builders, we are the agents of grace to a culture that desperately needs it, that is aching for it. And we have the privilege of doing the work of demonstrating it. This is what it means to have a faith that works. It means to be a people in between, to be a people of truth and grace, to be a people of knowing and understanding, to be a people of believing and behaving, of knowing and showing, of faith and works. So, are you good enough? Well, I think the answer is both yes and no. It's not comfortable for us to say we are both good enough and not good enough. Yes, we are worth dying for, and no, we are not perfect. But this is the paradox of grace. And this is our mission, and this is our purpose. Not just to be a place that embraces grace, but to be a people who demonstrate it, who know it and show it. And that leaves us with one thing: act like it.